What defines the 80s by April Morgan Roth. So each decade is defined by some things that make it unique, that set it apart from the previous decade or a new decade to come. Some of those things we wouldn't think necessarily impact that decade, but when you dig a little deeper, you could see that it definitely does impact the decade. Now, when I was thinking about what impacted the 1980s, I thought about various different things, clothing styles, to hairstyles, and then I thought, well, what made the change? What influenced those changes? And I really got to the bottom of it, and I thought, oh, well, that's easy. It was music. Music seems to talk to everybody in their own way. Whatever genre you listen to, it affects you. It affects your attitude, it affects your clothing choices. So then I thought, okay, well, let's dig a little bit deeper. What was significant of the 1980s? Well, big, large hair, crazy clothing styles, individualism, which we'll see over and over and over throughout the 80s. So I decided to go with rock hair bands. Now, some of the biggest bands out there, Guns N' Roses with Axl Rose and Slash, and Poison and Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, and of course the infamous Kiss with Gene Simmons there being the devil, were huge influences during the 1980s, and we'll see why in a bit. So what did they affect? They affected hairstyles and clothing styles, like attitude styles, sexual desires, rebellious desires, family structure, and political issues. The first thing it kind of affected was the hairstyles. We already saw in the 1970s as cut hair was starting to get big again. We see it most predominantly with what I call the Farrah Fawcett hairdo, and I jokingly joked with my mother about her Farrah Fawcett hairdo that she brought into the new millennium. But it's true. The 70s kind of catapulted this, like made it huge. But in the 80s, we saw that it wasn't just women growing their hair out and doing these huge hairstyles. It was men too, which a lot has to do with the 1980s bands. So then that leads us to clothing styles. Some of you may not be old enough to remember these, but I was very traumatized by parachute pants. They were very, very famous. They were very, very famous because of artists like the formerly known as Prince or whatever it is he's calling himself today, because of their colors and their shape and their size, and that they were kind of asexual, and they had a lot of different funky patterns that um, people really enjoyed kind of modge podging them together with other things. And then, of course, as you can see by my family photo here from the 80s, early 80s, we see that clothing was about patterns and about color, about bold, about identity. It wasn't necessarily to be cohesive at all. So then that comes to attitudes. And the biggest thing with attitudes we'll see comes from like the from sexual desires and rebellion and the family structure and political issues that we'll see in the next couple of slides. But it was really a carpe diem kind of attitude, like seize the day, take it, it's yours, you want it, be different, be individual, be bold, dare to dream, dare to get, dare to be. So then that leads us to sexual desires. Now, the 1980s did one great thing, and that great thing was they sexualized everything. And that was pretty much because of the huge boom in marketing and the huge boom in Hollywood and media and stuff. As you can see right here in the Time magazine, sex in the 80s, the revolution is over. Meaning that sex wasn't just designed for behind closed doors anymore. And we really have the 60s and 70s to thank for that. But the 80s, people really took to it and said, you know what? I can have sex with whomever I want, wherever I want, however I want. So we really see a rise in fetishes here. And of course, like I said before, Hollywood really embraced this. We see a lot of sexualism and a lot of sexual tension really become very prominent during 1980s movies like Fast Times at Ridgemont High, The Breakfast Club, Breakfast at Tiffany's, Top Gun. Sexualization wasn't necessarily like very forceful in your face. It was sometimes subtle, but it was always there, very easy for people to pick out and pull out. So then that leads us to rebellion. people really didn't want to look like Joe Schmo next door anymore. They wanted to find their own inner voice. They wanted to not only find their own inner voice, but they really wanted to project their own inner voice. So they did this by buying clothing and then making it their own by studying it up, ripping it up, cutting it, transforming it to fit them some way, somehow. And then, of course, hairstyles. As you can see, with spikes and mohawks and fro hats, different colors, different designs, different ways, different shapes. I remember being a kid in the 80s, and I could tell you I probably never saw the same mohawk twice. Everyone had a different style mohawk. So then that leads us to the family structure. Family structure really changed a great deal during the 80s, more so than any decade, if you ask me, because in the 80s, women's put the power suit back on. And they really said, you know what, I want to be a career woman. And then they went into the career. And we see a huge, huge, huge push of women delaying family or not even having families at all. Sort of this career woman, I can do it, I want to be a CEO, and a lot of them did do it and still are doing it. Um, we see a little bit of a backslide in the 90s into the early 2000s, but then we see women are now again um, pushing family back into their 30s and 40s and living a full life, being that career woman before having a family. We also see a change in the family dynamics and structure where your typical family wasn't just a mom and a dad and the kids being raised by the mom and dad. We see a lot of um, extended family coming together, living under one roof, and kind of helping each other. I know in the 80s, I had a huge extended family. We all lived in the same house. I lived in the same house with my cousins and my aunts, and that wasn't uncommon in the 80s. In fact, it was a very, very popular thing to do. And then that leads us to the last thing, the political. During the 1980s, gay wasn't new. Being gay wasn't new. Being lesbian wasn't new. Being transsexual, transgender wasn't new. We just heard more about it through popular musicals like Rent and outbreaks of AIDS and HIV, which is unfortunate, but it's not new. But what happened because of all of this is the LGBT community kind of became one and formed and became cohesive in the entire nation and started forming pride parades, which is exactly what it is. They're coming out saying, hey, I'm not ashamed of this. You shouldn't be ashamed of this. So if you are ashamed of this, then look the other way. So then that brings us back to this whole this individualistic idea that we're individuals. We should find our voices. We should be who we are, be what we want, how we want. And that kind of brings us back to the hair bands because they were saying, hey, I have this big crazy hair. I'm wearing these leather printed tight silk or maybe even leather pants on stage. I'm being a devil on stage. I'm doing this. I'm wearing hot red pants that are so tight that I probably have to cut them off my bum to get them off. And you know what? A lot of Americans saw this and said, you know what? You're right. If you can be that, then I can be that. And if I want to be that, I'm going to be that. So that's what defines the 80s, according to me, is the music, and more importantly, the rock music, the 80s, the big hair bands. Thank you for listening.